This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On Air. In this episode of Rewilding in Action, my guest and I talk about how understanding the past climate and environment where we live and predicting our future climate and environment can help us help nature to lead the way. Today's episode of Rewilding in Action is supported by Carries Bay Hotel, a Victorian pub with a reputation for great seafood meals and good hospitality. Carries Bay Hotel, just beyond Port Chalmers. For more information, go to carriesbayhotel.co.nz. Kia ora, welcome to Rewilding in Action with me, your host, Maureen Howard. Today I'm in the OAR FM studio with my guest, Associate Professor Michelle Knapp, who is based in the Department of Anatomy at Otago University. Michelle heads a really interesting research group, one of whose aims is to better understand how human activity shapes biodiversity. In this episode, Michelle and I are planning to take a deep dive into what rewilding means in a New Zealand context, by going back in time to understanding what New Zealand's ecology was like before humans arrived, to understanding our present-day situation of how humans have impacted New Zealand ecosystems, and to the future, our rewilding goals and how we can tackle them. Now, along the way, I'm hoping we can share more light on some of the issues in recent rewilding episodes on the West Harbour, such as the sea lions returning to the mainland, the complex interactions of introduced mammals like rats and mice, and my favourite, natural native forest regeneration. So welcome to the podcast, Michelle.
Thank you, Maureen. Thanks for having me.
Yes, I'm very excited to have you on the episode. I'm a little bit in awe of the scope and ambition of your research, but I actually think it's really important to take that big picture focus on our human activities. And so in rewilding, human management is minimised, and instead we're recognising that nature has the tools and the capacity to lead the recovery process to healthy ecosystems with a bit of helping hand from us humans to kickstart things on a better trajectory and to intervene when we need to. So anyway, that's the ideal of rewilding. So in this sense of rewilding, the current state of the ecosystem seems to be what's more important. So why is it also critical for us to kind of look backwards, to past ecosystems before humans came to New Zealand, to what it was like before?
I think it's kind of getting a baseline. I mean, that's at least how my brain works. I don't want to look back at 1,000 years and say, this is what we need to recreate, because that's not going to work. But I would like to understand the nature of the nature that we're trying to rewild. So the dynamic that has led us to where we are now. And from that, I think that gives us a good baseline to think about which path we want to take. Let's look at New Zealand from a more historic perspective. So how did we get where we are now? And my team has done a lot of work on birds over the last 10 years. So I'll use birds as an example because that's kind of what I know about. So New Zealand, for most of its history, millions of years, was densely forested. And so all the old bird lineages we have here, they're forest birds. Of course they are. And anything that arrived in New Zealand during that period of time had to be adapted to somehow survive in forests. Then we have the ice ages, and suddenly forests disappear. A lot of forest disappears, you get open habitat, and none of the native birds are adapted to that. So you get Australian birds coming in. And that's species that we now consider typically New Zealand. Takahe, Haast eagle, Isles harrier, all of these iconic New Zealand species, they actually arrived here, or their ancestors arrived here at the beginning of the ice ages, when the forest went. But then, of course, ice ages are forest, no forest, no forest. So everything that arrived here, whether it was forest adapted or not, had to adapt to forest or perish. And that was the situation until humans arrived. So you again have all these species that are forest adapted to some extent. And humans come in and take the forest out, immediately opening up the habitat. And again, the Australians come in. And that's the situation we have today. If you look at Pukeko, the ubiquitous swamp harrier, they haven't been here for more than 600 years or so. They came in because the habitat was opened up. And that's still ongoing. We've got the welcome swallows arriving, royal spoonbills, all of that. So this is the dynamic that we're working towards. And these species that come in, they haven't been introduced. They are native species in the sense that they self-introduced. They got here, but they only got here because we created the habitat for them, or they were only able to establish. They would have gotten here anyway, but they wouldn't have been able to establish.
So in the past, we would have had the occasional vagrant, but it wouldn't have survived. It wouldn't have bred because there wasn't the habitat for it.
Yeah, or there would have been a trickle of species that survive, but, a constant trickle, if you like. Whereas what we see is as soon as the habitat goes open, we have this flood of Australian open habitat birds. And then as soon as people come in, we have the same picture again happening.
Yeah, I think it's pretty cool that, we see this ecosystem changing in front of our eyes, and that ecosystems don't stay the same, do they?
Yeah, they're very dynamic. And I think that really matters when we think about rewilding. Because, how do we define it? Yeah, we say we want a habitat that is sustainable, or that is robust and can survive on its own, and that is dominated by native or endemic species, because there's a difference there, right? So, if we have a number of open habitat species that are clearly doing quite well. Pukeko is not in trouble. The swamp hare certainly isn't in trouble.
Paradise shelduck.
Yeah, paradise shelduck. They're a bit older though. They came in a bit earlier than that. But again, open habitat. And yeah, as Pascal put it, if no matter what the climate does, the shelduck will survive. And so this is that baseline that we're looking at. And then we can discuss about, okay, well, what do we actually want when we rewild? What's the scenario? What do we want to end up with? And what do we want to support? And that's an open question. I know there's many, many different opinions on that.
And in a way, the fact that we're even asking ourselves this question, it's a slightly arrogant question, isn't it? Because, nature has been doing this for millions of years and going along on its trajectory. And now we're thinking about, now what trajectory do we want to be heading in?
But that is probably because the trajectory that nature would take if we do absolutely nothing is probably not where we want to go. And for good reason, I think, coming from a conservation perspective, for good reason. This is, again, what is good reason? But obviously, my work is a lot in conservation. And for me, New Zealand does have a lot of unique species, endemic species that exist nowhere else in the world that are threatened. And I think we do have a responsibility to do our best to provide habitat for those species so that they can survive. And that's not always consistent with completely letting everything go wild, because then you probably have a quite European-dominated nature in many places that is not very suitable for our species here.
Yes. And I completely agree with you, Michelle, that we do have very precious endemic species here. And one of my favourites is the rifleman. And so we do have that responsibility because we have changed the habitat. And so, as you say, to give space for them. Another example is, I've talked a lot about on Rewilding in Action, is natural native forest regeneration.
Yeah.
And when we are planting, so we're thinking of maybe more ecological restoration work, we tend to go back and look at what was the land like historically, what was on this piece of land and what kind of species composition was it. So what kind of value do you think that is, for going back and thinking about what the land was like into how we want to restore things now?
With a view on a robust ecosystem that can survive without input, what would probably be more interesting is to figure out what will grow there over the next 100 years or so. Unfortunately, I think we're not quite at the stage. It seems to be very difficult at the moment in New Zealand because of the very dynamic climate to correlate any changes directly with climate change. It almost certainly has an impact, but what is it? So I think at the moment we don't have the data to go 100 years in advance and say, okay, on this patch of land, we're probably going to have a so-and-so forest. So these are the species we need to support. So what we have now, or what we know could grow there now, is probably our best proxy for what we want to get.
Yeah, that's looking for nature actually to take the lead in a way.
Exactly. If you look at the coastal forests, so there's a little patch of replanted patch at the end of Hayward Point Road, or you have Orokonui Eco Sanctuary where things have been replanted, but following roughly what would grow there, obviously, and that seems to be doing quite well. What you see there is very diverse. So it's a pioneer forest. Obviously, it's not sort of climax. It's what would normally grow there if forests disappeared naturally. So you have that sort of situation. And you can kind of imagine some of those plants will be absolutely fine with climate change in any way. Others might not, and they might then disappear, but would probably be replaced by species coming in. And I think while climate change happens quickly, I don't think it would happen. It happens so quickly that you don't get this natural succession, that it would just wipe out the forest and nothing is there that can replace it.
Yes, because one of the things that that concerns me a little bit about planting, and I've done a lot of planting myself, is that we're planting to this kind of past climate, and then because plants can't move about, with birds and stuff, they can move about if they don't like the climate. Plants can't. Once it's in the ground there, you've got to wait another 30 or 40 years to actually see if it's going to actually become rewilded, because really the sign of what's rewilding is when you've got seed coming off it and it's growing and it's viable and you've got the next generation. So we're locking ourselves in a little bit.
I'm not 100% sure about that, because I think if I think about planting, so I'm not saying, we need to plant everywhere. I'm very much on your side there when we talk about, where you can just let gorse take over and then let natural regrowth happen underneath. It doesn't work everywhere. But I think if we just provide a starting point. So if I look out where we are now, it's a paddock, and it has been a paddock for probably 100 years or something. There isn't a huge seed base for native regrowth, or in fact probably for gorse regrowth. It's just dense grass. So there, some support is required. So what do you do there? In my view, it's just put some pioneer plants in there. They will grow up. They will provide a habitat while they're growing. They provide seed base for other places. And yes, it might be that some of those will not do well in the future because the climate changes, because it gets too dry there or something like that. And they will leave gaps. But I suspect those gaps will then be naturally filled by something that does work in that environment. So it's not. I don't think of it as locking in. I just want to think of it as a baseline, as a starting point that then helps nature take over. Just a push in the right direction, sort of thing. I think that in many ways things work together, right? So you have places where you have a good seed base. I mean, you had Hendrik Koch here talking about Volko. We talked before about Hinnewey Reserve, and those are situations where you have kind of this patchwork of native. You have relatively young seed base under the exotics. So there you have a good situation for a gorse recovery, if we want to call it that way. But at the same time, if you plant these patches of native, you actually create the seed, local sources of seed that then can be distributed to places where they can grow. It all works together in my view. It just needs all of it. And
a couple of episodes ago, I interviewed Tim Curran about green fire breaks, and that seemed to me like a really cool way to do it, because obviously if you're wanting to rewild your back paddock or whatever, you do want to have a green fire break between your home and the land that you're rewilding, because a lot of our New Zealand plants are very low flammable. And so you can put in a lot of those interesting species that you might then want to seed that area. So maybe we should move on to the present, although the past, present and future, it's all mixed together. But we, as you have said, we've brought in so many species that we now have a situation where we've got a host of introduced mammals, and they're having all kinds of unintended consequences on the environment and interactions with each other. And a few episodes ago, I had Jimmy Fife and Claire Hagland in the studio to talk about Quarantine Island, Kamataurua, and the interesting rat-mouse balance that they had there, where they reduced their rat numbers and that allowed the mice to come in. And now so they have rats and mice, but at a lower level. So it's these kinds of complexities. How do we proceed? If we can't actually go back, it does seem to be very, very difficult to remove mice. If we actually can't go back, how do we proceed forward?
Yeah, and that is a really good question that I don't have a really good answer to. I don't know. It's in many ways we have that same problem with our predators. Coming back to my favorite birds again. It's pretty much consensus. The best way to rewild your native bird fauna is to get rid of the predators. But how do you do that?
And how do you do it in a way that doesn't require ongoing intervention forever.
Yeah. There's, work on that being done with possums. There are now talks about gene drives where they essentially wipe themselves out, if you like. And I suspect it will take innovative technology. We're still a bit away from that. So, there's work to be done. And we need to keep that aim in mind, but I don't have a good answer.
Because the other alternative is that we do allow some kind of new ecosystem to develop.
Yeah, in a New Zealand context, that change without any human input would be quite dramatic because it's essentially mammals taking over what was previously a purely bird ecosystem, if you like. And that has impacts on the flora just as well as on the fauna. So that's perhaps New Zealand. It's more challenging than in other places. I've worked, obviously being German, I've worked in Germany before, and conservation work I was involved there was actually looking at preserving sort of that fauna that exists now. That's got not much to do with the beech forest that would have existed there before everything got cut down. So it's, preservation of field hamsters and hares, partridge, all of these species that come in when the forest goes. But that's more or less accepting that, this is the environment we have now and this is the biodiversity we have in that environment, and just we can do our best to support that, which is adapted to the environment we have now.
Yes. And so for New Zealand, perhaps rewilding is always going to have to look a bit different. It's always going to have that more intervention. Is that what you're saying? If we want to keep our native and endemic species.
With the view of preserving those endemic species, yes. I mean, this is the major difference between Germany and New Zealand, right? Germany has no endemic species, nothing. I think there was one mouse, Microtus bavaricus, which I think was described only from Bavaria, but has since then never been found again. So, there is nothing there, whereas here we've got most of our fauna and flora is endemic.
I wonder if there is a place for a certain appreciation of non-natives as well in some locations.
Yeah, and as long as they contribute to functioning ecosystem, that takes the effort out of the maintenance. And it is difficult to say where I would like to think it works.
I guess gorse is one example.
Yeah, yes.
Yeah. But perhaps those examples are not so common. But I am interested in seeking out those examples, actually.
Yeah. Yeah, it is interesting, and I haven't thought about it very much, and I don't have good examples. You probably have a lot more than me, because as I said, in a conservation space, you think more about that native ecosystem that your native species are adapted to, and so I almost think of it in you have your New Zealand native ecosystem, which is your forests, your national park type of thing, and then you've got your anthropogenic, your human shaped ecosystem. And that's very different, and they have very different species adapted to it. And I almost compartmentalize that. And when I talk about rewilding in my head, it is essentially just shifting it from one box into the other box, like from the anthropogenic into the more natural environment. And, which ways can we use to get that? But that, of course, is not everyone's definition of rewilding.
No. And I guess it'll be an ongoing conversation, really. Yeah. And anyway, so we'll let's move on then to the sea lions, because that was last episode, and it's a great episode. I'm very happy with it. But to me, it's this fantastic example of a species that has been largely gone from our environment, but was once here and is coming back, but is a big animal. I think of the Northern Hemisphere, and they talk about, their reintroductions. Well, we're not having to actively do it. It's reintroducing itself. And it's that humans learning to live with a big animal again. So what kind of shifts do you see, like in how humans relate to nature, that will be required for us to live in a more rewilded environment?
There is us being humans and being very diverse. There is a very diverse response to that. And that's no different here than it is in Germany, where we have rewilding of wolf, lynx coming back in, where you have one group of people being very excited about it, me being one of them. And on the other hand, you have people who are either directly in reality directly affected in New Zealand would be fisheries, or in Germany, shepherds and so on and so forth, or perceived affected. I don't want a huge animal here, or I don't want to go paddling with sea lion under me. The latter I don't really think that much, but there are genuine interests there. So I don't think we can generalize. But I think what we have is an opportunity again. We have an opportunity to try again, in a way, right? So we've lost these species. In New Zealand, it was because of commercial exploitation. In Germany, with wolves and all, it was more the competition side of things. They were threatened, so therefore they got wiped out. And now we have this chance again. They've come back. So let's try again. Let's see if we can live with them. And, if we can convince at least a certain number of people who are not happy with it, that actually there isn't a huge amount of difficulty with this.
Yes. But it does require that mind shift. Everything being here for us versus us actually just being part of the system.
Yeah. And that is a mind shift, and it's going to be very easy for some to for a certain part of the population who is either not directly affected or open to the idea, or it's going to be more challenging when you are directly affected by the return of these animals. And
yeah. What makes you most hopeful in terms of, let's say, us living in a more rewilded, nature, biodiverse, rich Aotearoa? Like, what kind of signs of hope do you think are out there?
Well, for me, it is really the huge amounts of initiatives that work in that direction. And, it's not just, let's just plant new, it's different ways of doing it. But there are a lot of initiatives that think about rewilding, whichever way it works. And I have a feeling that number is increasing as well. And that makes me very hopeful and very excited. And, that's, in my view, I like to support that in any way I can. And I get to see students who are very excited about ecology that, come in with a wealth of knowledge. I don't need to teach them anything for like 3 semesters because they know more than me. That's great.
Thanks very much to Associate Professor Michelle Knapp for our interesting and wide-ranging discussion, and for the big picture thinking that he and his team are doing to help guide us forward with our rewilding practices and other ecological issues. 2 important points that Michael made about the way forward for rewilding in New Zealand is that unlike the Northern Hemisphere, we have got a high degree of endemism of both plants and animals, species found only here. So in particular, we've got to be more interventionist and control mammals if we're going to avoid losing much of our endemic flora and fauna. And at the same time, Michelle also made the point that we can't and we shouldn't try to recreate ecosystems that were here when humans first came to Aotearoa. The climate has changed, it's still changing. So ecologically, we're in new territory, and we need to be looking to nature to lead the way to show us what resilient ecosystems that are dominated by natives can look like. So thanks for listening to Rewilding in Action. I'm Maureen Howard. If you've enjoyed this episode, please remember to like it and to share it. In my next episode, I'm heading out to Ravensbourne on the West Harbour to chat with residents Rachel Gibb and Ursula Ellenberg about the rewilding achievements of their community to bring back native bush. Until next time, courtesy of the Department of Conservation, I will leave you with the vocalisations of takahe, one of the endemic species much appreciated by my guest, Associate Professor Michelle Knapp, a rewilder who is letting nature take the lead.
This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On the Air.